People ask me sometimes what the conclave smelled like. It is a strange question, I know. 30 years of interstellar diplomacy, 4 treaty negotiations, 2 wars narrowly averted through channels most governments will never acknowledge, and what people want to know when they find out who I am, what they lean in and ask at dinner parties and memorial luncheons, and the occasional university lecture I am still roped into giving, is what the chamber smelled like. As though the sensory detail will unlock something the history texts have elided. I tell them the truth. It smelled like stone and recirculated air, and a faint chemical sweetness that the Thasari secreted when they were confident. By the end of my posting, I could track the mood of the Thasari delegation by the quality of that smell alone. Confident, a sweetness, almost floral, that gathered near the ceiling vents. Uncertain, nothing at all, a pointedly clean absence. And afraid smelled like copper, sharp and close, the way a cut finger does before you notice the blood. On the night of the vote, it smelled like flowers. I want to be precise about this, because precision is what that night demands of me. I have given testimony in closed proceedings. I have written the classified account. I have reviewed the record enough times that the sequence of events is as settled in my mind as the arrangement of furniture in my childhood home. But the smell is the thing I keep coming back to, because it tells you everything about what the Thasari believed they were doing. They believed they had already won. The confidence was in the air before the session was even gavelled open. My name is Lena Vazic. In the year the vote was taken, I was 53 years old, 17 years into a posting that had consumed most of what a person might otherwise call a life. Senior Envoy, Grade 7, representing the federated worlds of humanity at the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds. It is a title that sounds grander than it was. By the end, it meant being the person in the room who absorbed the insults so that no one behind me had to. It meant knowing which conclave procedures could be invoked and which were theater, and learning not to confuse the two. It meant reading a chamber the way a sailor reads weather, and understanding that some storms cannot be navigated, only survived. I had been reading this particular storm for 11 months. The Conclave of Sovereign Worlds met in a structure on the orbital station designated Meridian Crossing, in a chamber called the Hall of Compact, which was a name chosen either with magnificent irony or none at all, depending on your interpretation of what the conclave had become by then. It was a large room. That is the first thing to understand. Not vast in the way of certain spaces that seem to exist solely to diminish you. It was large in the way that a courthouse is large, or a bank built in the century of its peak confidence. The ceiling was domed glass, and through it you could see, on a clear transit day, the drift of station traffic and the angular geometries of docked vessels against a field of black. The floor was polished helioderm, a pale amber stone quarried from the Thasari home world that the Thasari had donated, upon founding the chamber 400 years ago. The walls held tiered seating in a wrapped crescent, and the crescent held, on the night in question, representatives of 47 member species. Humanity was the 48th. We sat as we always sat, in the observer tier. This is a detail I should explain because it matters to everything that followed. The conclave operated in 2 tiers of standing: full member status, which came with voting rights, treaty protections, and access to the closed arbitration chambers where the real decisions were made; and observer status, which came with a seat in the crescent, the right to submit written positions, and no vote. Humanity had held observer status for 9 years. The path to full membership required a sponsoring delegation of at least 3 full members, the satisfaction of an economic assessment, and a positive resolution of any outstanding arbitration claims against the applicant. We had satisfied the economic assessment 4 years prior. We had a sponsoring delegation, barely, and grudgingly, from 3 small members who had found human trade routes useful. And we had 1 outstanding arbitration claim, filed by the Thasari Consolidated Authority, alleging that a human mining operation in the Vethara Belt had violated the terms of a secondary protocol attached to a treaty that humanity had been allowed to accede to on observer terms. The claim was 6 years old. The Arbitration Commission had twice declined to schedule a hearing. The Thasari had twice filed procedural objections to the declination. The whole apparatus had the particular texture of deliberate stalling, the kind of bureaucratic inertia that is indistinguishable from policy when practiced with sufficient patience. I had written, over 6 years, 41 formal responses to various stages of this process. I had sat across tables from Thasari legal delegates whose confidence never wavered, whose sweetness never faded, and I had understood by year 3 that the claim was not really about the Vethara Belt. It was a door they held closed because they had decided, somewhere in the interior of their political calculus, that humanity should not walk through it. What I had not fully accounted for was what they planned to do with the door itself. 11 months before the vote, I received a communication through a channel I will not identify, from a source I will not name, that the Thasari were preparing to move against us at the procedural level. Not a hearing on the arbitration claim. That would have required evidence, argument, a structured process. What they had in mind was simpler: a resolution before the full conclave, under the provisions of Article 12 of the Compact Charter, to revoke humanity's observer status on grounds of sustained procedural noncompliance, and to expel the human delegation pending resolution of the outstanding claim. I read this communication in my office on the station. I read it 3 times, then I sat still for a long time. Article 12 had been invoked twice in the history of the conclave, both times against polities that had genuinely ceased to engage with conclave processes. One had stopped attending sessions entirely, the other had publicly repudiated the Compact Charter. The provisions had never been used as what they were about to be used as: a procedural weapon against a member who had participated in every session, filed every required submission, and whose outstanding claim was the direct result of the opposing party's deliberate obstruction. The elegance of it, from their perspective, was that the Compact Charter did not require a finding of bad faith. It required only a simple majority resolution on grounds of noncompliance, and noncompliance was a category with borders flexible enough to contain whatever the Thasari and their allied delegations chose to pour into it. I drafted 11 messages to various superiors, colleagues, and allied representatives over the following week. I sent none of them. The instinct was to inform, to escalate, to bring the intelligence forward and let the apparatus above me decide what to do with it. I had done that across 17 years, dozens of times brought forward what I knew, framed the options as clearly as I could, and stepped back to let the decision-making machinery turn. That was the job. That was what senior envoys did. The decision-making machinery existed for exactly this kind of situation, and the decision-making machinery had more leverage, more relationships, and more strategic visibility than I had from where I sat. The decision-making machinery also, as I had observed across 17 years, had a strong preference for avoiding confrontation with the Thasari. This was not cowardice, exactly. It was the accumulated weight of prior calculations, each individually reasonable, that had produced a collective posture of managed accommodation. The Thasari were the largest single bloc in the conclave. The Thasari had, over 4 decades, built a web of dependencies and obligations among the smaller members that made opposing them expensive. The decision-making machinery had done the arithmetic on confrontation many times and had consistently found the arithmetic unfavorable. The decision-making machinery's likely response to my intelligence was to authorize private negotiation, because private negotiation was what the arithmetic recommended. I sat with this for 3 days. Not paralyzed, I was doing other work, keeping appointments, filing routine communications. But underneath everything else, I was sitting with the question of what I actually knew and what I actually believed. What I knew was that the Thasari planned to move against us. What I believed, and this was the part that I could not file, because belief is not evidence, was that private negotiation would produce a short-term arrangement and a long-term trap. We would trade something of substance for the removal of a procedural threat, and the procedural threat would return in 5 years or 8 years or 10, improved by what the Thasari had learned about our negotiating limits the first time. We had seen them do it. The archives knew. The pattern was there in black and white in the institutional memory that no one had ever assembled into a single document. That was when I understood what I actually needed to do. What I did instead was start counting. I counted votes. I counted commitments. I counted the delegations that owed the Thasari something and the ones that merely feared them, and the ones that neither owed nor feared, but would vote with the prevailing wind because that was what small polities did when they wanted to remain in the chamber longer than one generation. I counted the ones who had trade agreements with humanity that they valued, and I counted the ones who had trade agreements with humanity that they could afford to lose. I counted the 3 sponsors who had backed our membership application, and I ran the specific calculation of how each of them would weigh their sponsorship commitment against the social cost of standing against the Thasari on a procedural question. The Volith aggregate was first. They had sponsored our application because we shared a transit corridor that made the relationship commercially convenient, and because their senior representative, a careful woman named Delegate Holith, had found Mirova personally useful during a navigational dispute 2 years prior. That personal relationship was real, but it was the kind of relationship that a formal vote exposes. When the room is watching and the Thasari are watching, and the question is whether you stand against the largest bloc over a procedural matter involving a species you have known for less than a decade, personal regard has a way of finding limits. I put Holith at 60% for abstention, 40% for a quiet withdrawal of sponsorship before the vote was even called. I was, as it turned out, slightly optimistic. The Mervith Concord was second. Their sponsorship had always been more transactional. They wanted access to our outer corridor mapping data, and the sponsorship was the leverage point for that negotiation. They had not yet gotten what they wanted. The calculation was inverted. If we were expelled, they lost the leverage, which gave them a reason to oppose the expulsion. But the Thasari had something they wanted more than our mapping data, which I had learned 6 months earlier and had not fully processed at the time. I processed it now. The Mervith were out. The Sethari principalities were third, and in retrospect, the most interesting case. They had sponsored our application for reasons that had never been entirely clear to me. They had no significant commercial relationship with humanity, no territorial adjacency, no obvious political debt. When I went back through the archive of their sessions and votes, what I found was a pattern of sponsorship for non-conclave polities that went back 30 years, always small polities, always ones that the Thasari had been working against. The Sethari, I concluded, had a principle about this. Not a stated principle, not a policy they advertised, but a consistent behavior that amounted to a principle. They would not oppose the Thasari on the floor because they were small and the cost was too high. But they would quietly stand with the people the Thasari were trying to push out, for as long as standing quietly was an option. Principle is not a vote. I put the Sethari at 85% for abstention the moment the political cost of standing exceeded the threshold of quiet. The numbers were not good. I sent one message, not to my superiors, not to the Allied delegations, to the Compact Archives Office, requesting a full historical record of every Article 12 proceeding, every procedural challenge, every Thasari filed arbitration claim over the previous 40 years. Then I waited. The Archives Office delivered the documents 3 weeks later. It took me another 2 weeks to read them. What I found confirmed a pattern that I had suspected, but had not had the documentation to prove. The Thasari had used procedural mechanisms to stall or expel 6 other delegations over the preceding 4 decades. 3 of those delegations were now full conclave members, having eventually cleared the procedural obstacles. 2 had never returned. 1 had reached its own arrangements and stopped caring whether it was in the chamber or not. In 4 of the 6 cases, the initial procedural challenge had served as a pressure mechanism to extract concessions, trade route agreements, resource access, political endorsements, before the challenge was quietly withdrawn. I read this, and I understood what they wanted. They wanted a concession. The vote was not the end of the process. The vote was the pressure. They expected, based on 6 prior iterations of this exact maneuver, that the prospect of expulsion would produce a representative willing to negotiate privately, quietly, without witnesses, to offer something worth more than the seat at the table we did not yet have. This was the moment I made the decision I have spent the following decades being asked about. I could have brought the pattern to my superiors and asked for authorization to negotiate. I believe I could have gotten it. I believe a private agreement could have been reached that would have extracted us from the Article 12 proceeding and placed us back on the path to full membership, possibly within 2 years. I believe the price would have been a resource access agreement in the Vethara Belt, the very thing the arbitration claim was nominally about, plus a covert commitment to support 1 or 2 Thasari political positions over the following decade. It would have been shameful, in the way that many diplomatic agreements are shameful, the kind of thing that functions perfectly well and that no one ever discusses in public. I did not bring it to my superiors. What I did instead was file a formal response to the Article 12 notice, which I had by then received through official channels, in which I documented, in full, the historical pattern I had found in the archives. 40 years of procedural weaponization. 6 prior uses of the same mechanism, the statistical impossibility of the pattern arising from genuine compliance concerns. I filed it under public record, which meant it became part of the permanent conclave archive the moment it was received, viewable by any delegation. I copied every allied delegation. I copied the Arbitration Commission. I copied the Compact Charter Review Council, which was a body so rarely convened that half the delegations had probably forgotten it existed. Then I sent the message to my superiors. The response was not warm. I will not reproduce the specifics. What matters is that I was instructed, in terms that left no interpretive flexibility, to withdraw the filing and prepare to engage in private negotiation. I was told that the approach I had taken was inflammatory, that it had embarrassed allied delegations who had not been consulted, and that it had almost certainly hardened Thasari resolve rather than softened it. My superiors were right about the last part. The vote was scheduled for 38 days after my filing. In the 38 days between filing and vote, 3 things happened. First, the Thasari issued a formal rebuttal to my filing, a detailed point-by-point response that was, from a legal standpoint, quite good, and that served the secondary purpose of making the exchange fully public, which was something they had not originally wanted. Second, 2 of humanity's 3 sponsoring delegations quietly withdrew their sponsorship applications, citing the need to review their positions in light of ongoing proceedings. Third, the delegation of the Rotha Communion, a small but strategically positioned member that had been doing quiet, significant trade in data and navigational records with human commercial interests, sent me a private communication asking whether any of the archived documents related to the Sethavar Corridor arbitration proceeding of 31 years ago. They did. I sent the relevant documents to the Rothai delegation without comment. The Rothai delegation did not vote on the Article 12 resolution. They were absent. Their chair was empty. 3 other small delegations were also absent. Absence is not opposition. It changes the denominator but does not produce a negative vote, and the resolution passed with a clear majority. But absence meant something in chamber politics, and everyone in that room understood what it meant. The Thasari sweetness, when I catalogued it by scent on the day of the vote, was slightly thinner than it had been 11 months earlier. Still confident, not quite as certain. I want to tell you about the hall on the morning of the vote, because the hall is important. The session was called for the 9th hour. I arrived at the 7th, alone. My junior staff had their instructions and would join me at the 8th. I wanted an hour in the empty chamber, which is something I had done before significant sessions throughout my career, a habit I had picked up from my own first mentor, who had told me that a room tells you things before it is occupied that it conceals once the bodies fill it. She had been right. Rooms have a quality when they are empty that the presence of people erases, not just the obvious physical details, but something about proportion and intention and the accumulated purpose of a space. The Hall of Compact had been built to house the governing body of 47 member worlds, and when you stood in it without the 47 delegations present, you could feel the scale of that ambition, and also, if you were paying attention, the ways in which the ambition had contracted over 4 centuries into something more procedural and less aspirational than its builders had intended. I walked the perimeter. The heliodrome floor was cold at that hour, or at least the station's climate management made it feel cold. A slightly lower temperature in the early sessions was a deliberate environmental choice. I had learned, based on the Conclave's founding-era research showing that cooler conditions reduced verbal aggression in certain member species. The research was 400 years old and had never been formally reviewed. The floor remained cold. I looked at the empty Thasari seats, which were the largest block in the crescent, 19 seats arranged in a formal chevron, the senior position at the point, the junior position spreading back in 2 wings. I had sat across from those seats for 17 years. I knew the patterns of occupation, which Thasari delegates sat where by seniority, which of them arrived early and which late, which of them consulted with each other during sessions, and which were isolated presences who voted on instruction without apparent personal engagement. I knew the way Vetharsian held herself in the lead position, the particular stillness she projected that was a deliberate signal of controlled authority, because I had used the same signal myself often enough to recognize it in another practitioner. I looked at the observer tier, where the 2 remaining seats of our delegation sat apart from the others, as observer seats always did. They were positioned at the end of the crescent, not in the main body, a placement that was, officially, a matter of procedural category, observer members sitting outside the main voting block. In practice, it meant that you were always slightly to the side of the action, always at a slight angle to the center of the room, always visible as adjacent but not central. 17 years in that positioning had given me a very good view of the chamber. I had watched more of what happened in the Hall of Compact from those seats than most full members ever had, because full members watched the proceedings. I watched the room. I stood on the heliodrome floor and looked up through the domed glass at the station traffic, and I thought about what I was going to do. The thing I had not told my superiors, the thing I had not filed, the thing I had told no one was this: I knew we were going to lose the vote. I had known since the filing. The filing was not an attempt to win the vote. The filing was the record. It was the thing that would exist in the permanent archive regardless of what the chamber decided. It was the version of events that would be present in the documentation when someone, someday, wanted to understand what had happened to the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds. Because I believed, by that morning, that something was going to happen to it, and that the mechanism by which it happened had been set in motion long before I arrived in the chamber. I believed the conclave was becoming what institutions become when they mistake procedural power for actual power. I had been watching it for 17 years. I had watched the Thasari use the compact's mechanisms for 17 years in service of an agenda that had nothing to do with the compact's stated purposes, and I had watched the other members tolerate it, because the alternative was the expense and difficulty of opposition. I had watched the Rothai communion tolerate it. I had watched dozens of small polities tolerate it, and I had watched humanity tolerate it because tolerance was the cost of the seat at the table. The thing I understood, standing on the helioderm floor at the 7th hour, was that expulsion removed the cost. If they expelled us, we were no longer bound by any of the treaty obligations attached to observer status. We were no longer constrained by the secondary protocols that had generated the arbitration claim in the first place. We were no longer participants in the procedural processes that the Thasari used as instruments. We would be, from the moment the gavel came down, entirely free of the Conclave's jurisdiction. And we had been building things for 17 years, outside that jurisdiction. I had not built them. I want to be honest about this. I had not orchestrated anything. What I had done, what my predecessors had done, what the commercial interests and the exploratory missions and the non-conclave treaty relationships had built across 17 years of parallel engagement with the wider galaxy, was create a body of relationships, commitments, resource agreements, and mutual obligations that existed entirely outside the conclave framework. The Vethara Belt mining operation was part of it. The navigational data agreements with the Rothai communion were part of it. The 7 small systems that had found it more useful to talk to human commercial representatives than to wait for conclave arbitration to settle their disputes were part of it. None of it was organized. None of it had been designed. It was the accumulated texture of 17 years of humans being in the galaxy and doing things, and it had a shape I had only recently begun to fully see. The Thasari had been looking at the Vethara Belt claim. They had been looking at it the entire time. They had not been looking at anything else. My junior staff arrived at the 8th hour. Mirova Sen, second secretary, 29 years old, who had been with me for 4 years and who had the quality I most valued in junior staff. She asked the right questions and did not ask them at the wrong time. And Corin Adalith, protocol officer 44, who had spent 12 years in conclave-adjacent postings and who understood the mechanics of sessions the way a watchmaker understands the interior of a watch. They arrived and sat down, and neither of them asked me how I felt about what was coming, which was the correct decision, and I was grateful for it. The session opened. The chamber filled. The Thasari delegation arrived in their full formal complement, 19 members, wearing the multi-layered ceremonial robes they reserved for sessions of significant outcome, which told you something about their confidence. Their lead delegate was Counselor Vetharsian, who had been their senior representative for 11 years and who was, I want to be honest about this, a skilled diplomat. Not a kind one, not an honest one in any sense of the word I would use. But skilled, patient, thorough, aware of the texture of rooms. She did not look at me when she took her seat. She had not looked at me directly since the filing. The reading of the resolution took 40 minutes. It was a detailed document, as these things are, and the conclave's presiding chair, an elder of the Selving Compact, a species whose deliberateness of speech I had come to appreciate over 17 years even when it slowed proceedings to a pace that tested patience, read every clause aloud in the common trade tongue, and then waited for the interpretive capsules to transmit before proceeding to the next. 40 minutes of clauses, subclauses, procedural citations, findings, and declarations, all amounting to the same thing. The federated worlds of humanity were being asked to leave. I sat through all of it. Mirova and Corin sat on either side of me. None of us moved. None of us whispered. None of us consulted documents or exchanged notes or did any of the small fidgeting things that diplomats do when they are anxious or calculating. I had been in rooms before where my stillness had been read as composure. I let it be read that way. The truth was simpler. I had made my decision 4 months earlier, and the reading of the resolution was not going to change it. The vote was open, which meant each delegation's position was recorded by name. I counted them as they came. When the final count was read, 31 in favor, 9 opposed, 7 absent or abstaining. Presiding Chair Orvithal looked toward the observer tier and announced, in the formality that the occasion demanded, that the resolution had passed and that the human observer delegation was requested to surrender its documentation of standing within 7 standard days. There was a pause in the chamber. The quality of the pause is something I have been asked to describe, and I will try. It was the pause of a room that had expected something and was waiting for it. A protest, a formal objection, a request for clarification, something. Diplomats are people who talk, and a room full of diplomats that has just done something significant expects the response to that significance to be verbal. I stood up. Mirova and Korin stood up with me, exactly 1 second behind, which is a thing I had asked them to do and which they had done perfectly. I gathered the documents in front of me. I did not leave them, which is a choice that carries meaning in conclave protocol. Abandoned documents signal disorder, and I did not want disorder, tucked them under my arm, and walked out of the observer tier. No one spoke. We walked the full length of the chamber floor to the exit. The heliodrome clicked softly under our shoes. I did not look at the Thasari tier. I did not look at Vetharsian. I looked at the exit doors, which were large and pale and open, and I walked toward them at the pace of someone who has somewhere to be. The doors closed behind us. We stood in the corridor outside the Hall of Compact for a moment. Not for a dramatic reason. There was no theater in it, no pause for effect. We stopped because the corridor had a bench, and Korin sat down on it, and I looked at him for a moment and then sat down beside him, because a career's worth of hard sessions had taught me that the body deserves a moment after the thing it has been carrying finally lands. Mirova remained standing. She was looking at the doors. She said, "That's it." I said, "That's it." Korin said very quietly, "Did we just?" I said, "Yes." We sat there for perhaps 2 minutes. Through the closed doors, we could hear the muffled continuation of the session, the procedural completion, the recording of the vote, the formal reading of the resolution's implementation schedule, the conclave completing its paperwork, finishing the sentence they had started. A Selvine page came through the side corridor, stopped, looked at the 3 of us sitting and standing outside the hall, and continued without comment. The Selvine are observant people. He would have known what our presence in the corridor meant. Then Mirova said, "We have 7 days to surrender our documentation of standing." I said, "We won't be surrendering it in 7 days." She looked at me. I said, "We'll surrender it on day 6, not before. They get every day we're owed." I stood up. "Come on. There's a lot of communication to file before this session record posts publicly." That was all that happened in the chamber. That is all that happened in the corridor. I want to be honest that the weeks that followed were not triumphant. They were exhausting and uncomfortable, and there were moments, several of them, when the weight of what I had set in motion, which was far larger than what I had intended to set in motion, pressed down on the kind of night thoughts that don't respond to reason. I had filed a public document that was going to be read by historians as the inciting act of everything that followed. Whether it would be read with approval or contempt depended entirely on whether everything that followed was worth the cost. I did not know in those nights that it would be. What I knew was what my superiors communicated to me, which I will summarize. I was being recalled for formal review. My actions had been unauthorized. The situation required management. I was to return to the home system and make myself available for a process that would determine whether my career continued. I submitted my travel arrangements. I packed my office. I spent a morning going through 17 years of archived communications, not because I planned to do anything with them, but because I wanted to hold the record of them. The accumulation of messages and responses and filed positions and procedural citations that represented a career spent in a room that had, in the end, decided it did not want me there. I copied them to a personal archive. I noted, without particular emotion, that the record was very long. On my last night on Meridian Crossing, the Rothai delegation's first secretary came to my quarters. He was a young man, they aged differently, the Rothai. He was probably 70 standard years, which put him at something like 40 in human terms, and he brought a bottle of something that was not quite wine and sat down across from me, and did not speak for a while, which is how the Rothai do things. He said, eventually, "The set of our documents were useful." I said, "I'm glad." He said, "The Communion has 7 ongoing agreements with human commercial entities. The Communion values those agreements." I said, "So do we." He said, "The Communion does not consider those agreements to be contingent on your presence in this chamber." I looked at him for a moment. He was doing what Rothai diplomats do, which is give you the thing they want you to understand in a form that is technically neutral and therefore carries no obligation. He was telling me that what we had built outside the conclave was safe, that the Rothai were not going to follow the Thassaris' lead and treat our expulsion as a reason to distance themselves from us. That the 7 agreements, and by implication, the shape of the thing I had only recently begun to fully see, would survive the vote. "Thank you," I said. He poured 2 glasses of the not quite wine. We sat and drank them, and did not talk about anything that mattered, which is the most comfortable kind of conversation you can have on a difficult night. The review took 8 months. I will not render it in detail. I was not dismissed. I was not vindicated either in any formal sense. What the review produced was a finding that my actions, while unauthorized, had been undertaken in good faith with the goal of documenting conclave procedural misconduct, and that the public filing had created a record of value to future diplomatic positioning. It was the kind of finding that means, we cannot defend what you did, and we cannot afford to punish you for it, and we hope you appreciate that this middle path is the best we can offer. I was placed on administrative assignment. I spent 2 years writing analytical assessments of conclave procedural history, which was work I found genuinely interesting, and which gave me an amount of time with the archives I would not otherwise have had. In those 2 years, the shape I had been beginning to see came into focus. The Rothai Communion formalized 3 of their 7 agreements with human commercial entities into full governmental accords. The first time the Rothai had entered governmental accords with a non-conclave polity in living memory. The Hailvan Directorate, a mid-tier system that had been nominally conclave-aligned for 2 centuries without ever achieving full membership, opened direct diplomatic contact with the Office of Humanities External Affairs. The Vethara Belt Mining Consortium, the one whose operation had been the stated subject of the Thassari arbitration claim, expanded its operation, unconstrained now by the secondary protocols, and in the process established a supply and servicing relationship with 4 systems in the outer transit corridors that had previously dealt only through conclave-licensed intermediaries. None of this was organized. None of it was the result of a policy. It was the same texture of accumulated engagement that had been building for 17 years, now moving faster in the absence of the conclave constraint. What I watched from my administrative posting was the shape of a compact taking form without anyone having designed a compact. The Thassari watched it too. I know this because their response was predictable, which is to say, procedural. They filed 2 new arbitration claims against human commercial interests operating in the Vethara Belt expansion area, and submitted a formal complaint to the Conclave's External Relations Commission about the Rothai governmental accords. The complaint to the External Relations Commission was, as a legal matter, entirely without basis, since the Rothai had the sovereign right to enter accords with non-conclave polities. The arbitration claims were slightly more substantive, but they were claims against commercial entities with no conclave standing, and the Arbitration Commission had no jurisdiction over them. The Thassari, in other words, had brought out the tools that had always worked for them, and were discovering that the thing they were trying to apply them to was no longer in reach. It is a particular quality of institutional arrogance that it does not update quickly. The Thasari had used procedural mechanisms to manage competitors for 4 decades. The mechanisms had worked. The mechanism had produced, in the short term, the outcome they wanted. They had expelled us, and they had not yet processed that the expulsion had produced an outcome they had not modeled. Or perhaps they had modeled it and dismissed it. I was not in a position to know. What I know is that 3 years after the vote, Vetharsian retired from her position as Thasari lead delegate. The official announcement cited her long service. It did not cite the fact that the Thasari Internal Commerce Council had spent those 3 years dealing with the downstream effects of the Vethara belt expansion on their own resource margins in the outer corridors, a subject that had occupied considerably more of her final years than she had likely planned. I was returned to active diplomatic posting 4 years after the review, not to Meridian Crossing, to the outer corridor systems, where the non-conclave relationships had been developing fastest, and where the work of formalizing what had grown informally was the most demanding. I spent 7 years at that work. I will not describe all of it. What I will say is that the work had a different quality than the 17 years at the Conclave. At the Conclave, I had spent my days in a room designed to diminish the things I represented. In the outer corridors, I spent my days in rooms designed by people who wanted what I had to offer, not because they had been forced to the table, not because a larger power had sent them there, but because the relationship was useful and they knew it and they said so plainly. The Halvan Directorate was the first full governmental relationship we built. Their system sat at the intersection of 3 transit corridors that the Conclave's mapping authority had never properly charted. One of the consequences of the Conclave's institutional geography, which tended to concentrate attention on the interior systems where the powerful members sat. The Halvan had been notionally conclave-aligned for 2 centuries, which meant they sent a delegation to sessions and paid their compact assessments and received approximately nothing in return, because nothing in their system was strategically interesting to any of the full members who might have advocated for their interests. They had been trying, for 11 years before I arrived, to get the Conclave's navigational registry to update the transit charts for the 2nd corridor. The registry had twice promised a survey, and twice reassigned the survey vessels to higher priority sectors. I sat with the Halvan Director of External Relations, a woman named Velith Koron, who had been in her position for 16 years, and who had the particular quality of patience that belongs to people who have watched institutions fail them too many times to be surprised by it anymore. I did not offer her what the Conclave had not delivered. I offered her what I could actually do, a navigational survey by human commercial vessels already operating in the corridor, whose charts we would share in full, combined with a direct communications relay that would let her system's transit traffic bypass the registry clearance bottleneck entirely. It would take 4 months. It would cost, in human terms, the equivalent of a moderately priced commercial contract. She looked at me for a long moment after I finished. She said, "Why?" It was the right question. I told her the truth, because the corridor was there and our people were using it, and accurate charts made everyone safer, and a communications relay that worked was worth more than a promise in a queue. She said, "The Conclave promised us a survey for 11 years. I said, "I know." She said, "You are not the Conclave." I said, "No, we're not." The survey was completed in 3 months and 2 weeks. The relay went live 2 months after that. Velith Koron sent me a message when the first transit clearance came through the new relay without the registry delay. The message was 2 sentences. It said the ship cleared in 4 minutes. It used to take 11 days. That was how the Halvan relationship began. It was not dramatic. It was 4 months of work and a 2-sentence message. But it was the kind of thing that, repeated across 7 systems over 7 years, becomes the texture of a compact. It is remarkable, in retrospect, how much of the conclave years I had spent managing the experience of not being quite wanted. I had not fully understood how much of my attention that consumed until it was no longer consuming it. In my 11th year back in active posting, we formalized the Compact of Free Worlds. I was not the architect of it. That credit belongs to people more patient and more visionary than I have ever claimed to be. I was the senior representative at the final negotiating session, because seniority and the particular relationships I had built in the outer corridors over 7 years had put me at that table, and because someone had to hold the pen when the documents were signed. The 7 founding systems were present. The Rothai Communion sent an observer. The Hailvan Directorate signed as a founding member, which had not been certain until 3 days before the session. Mirova Sen, who had long since outgrown the role of junior staff, and was by then the lead diplomat of the Outer Corridor mission, sat across from me at the long table and did not say anything sentimental about how far we had come, which is one of the many things I have always appreciated about her. The Compact of Free Worlds was not, on the day of its founding, a power that rivaled the Conclave. I want to be clear about this, because the historical accounts sometimes imply a kind of overnight transformation that did not happen. What the Compact was, on the day of its founding, was a coherent structure. It was the formalization of a shape that had been growing for 2 decades without structure. It answered to no conclave charter. It had its own arbitration mechanisms, which were simpler than the conclaves and by design more difficult to weaponize procedurally. We had been careful about that. It had, by the time of its founding, a combined commercial tonnage that exceeded the Thasari's primary corridor networks, and a navigational database that included transit data the Conclave's own charts did not have. It had, through the Rothai relationship, a biological and agricultural exchange that had become indispensable to 3 of the founding systems' food security. What it also had on the day of its founding was a founding charter that took 11 minutes to read aloud in its entirety. I know because I read it. It contained 23 articles, and the 23rd, the last one, the one that defined the terms under which a non-member polity could apply for full membership, was the one I had written myself, in draft, during the 2nd year of my administrative assignment, and had left in a folder I did not expect anyone to open. Mirova had opened it. She had found it. She had, without telling me, refined it considerably and submitted it to the drafting committee as a working document. I discovered this when I read the final charter and recognized the structure of the argument in Article 23, and I looked across the table at her, and she looked back at me with an expression of complete professional neutrality. I did not say anything about it. Some things are best received in silence. And it had a fleet. Not because anyone had decided to build one in defiance of the conclave. Because 17 years of human commercial and exploratory activity in the outer corridors had produced the logistical infrastructure that produced the fleet as a natural consequence. The vessels existed because they were needed for things. They simply also happened to represent, in aggregate, a defensive capacity that the conclave's military assessors, when they eventually ran the numbers, which I have reason to believe happened somewhere between the 3rd and 5th year of the Compact's existence, found uncomfortable. 6 years after the founding. I was 67. I had been retired for 1 year. Actual retirement this time. I had kept my promise to myself that I would stop when the work of the outer corridor postings was done, and it was done, in the sense that the thing I had gone there to build was built. I was at home, which is a small property in a temperate zone that I had not spent enough time in during my career and which I found in retirement to be genuinely pleasant. I was reading. I was sleeping adequately. I had a garden that required more attention than I had given it during my posting years, and I was giving it that attention, and finding that the work of coaxing things from soil was not entirely unlike the work of coaxing agreements from resistant parties, except that the soil did not have political objectives. The call came from Mirova. She told me that a conclave delegation had arrived at the Compact's outer transit station and had requested a meeting with our senior diplomatic representative. Not an observation mission, not an arbitration inquiry. A formal diplomatic approach, requesting a meeting at the governmental level for the purpose of discussing. She read me the exact language. The terms of a potential collaborative framework between the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds and the Compact of Free Worlds. I said nothing for a moment. Mirova said, "I know." I said, "Who is leading it?" She said, "Someone called Advocate Sarathvel, Thasari." I sat with that for a moment. The Thasari, sending a delegation to request a collaborative framework with a body whose founding act had been the formalization of the relationships we had built after the Thasari expelled us. It was, as these things go, a complete sentence. Mirova said, "We want you to receive them." I said, "I'm retired." She said, "I know, will you?" There is a moment in a career when the thing you spent the career building asks you to be present for the moment it fully becomes itself. I believe it is a mistake to miss that moment. I told her yes. I arrived at the Compact's outer transit station 4 days later. It was a different kind of room from the Hall of Compact. The architecture was not grand. It was functional, clean, efficient, built by people who needed a room for meetings and built one, without the 4 centuries of accumulated symbolism that the Conclave's chamber carried. There was a long table, good light from a high window that showed the transit lanes outside, chairs that were adequate. I had asked for no particular formality of presentation. The Compact's flag was present, as protocol required. The founding charter was displayed on the wall, as it always was in our formal meeting spaces. That was enough. The Thasari delegation was 5 members. Advocate Sarathvel was younger than I expected, perhaps 30 standard years, which the Thasari diplomats of that generation were not supposed to be in lead positions yet, which told me something about the internal pressure that had produced this delegation. She was well prepared. I could read her preparation the way I had read Vetharsian's decades earlier, the quality of attention in the eyes, the deliberateness of the body language, the way the whole posture said, "I know this room, even if I have never been in it." She had done her work. She offered the formal greeting in the trade tongue, the same trade tongue in which presiding chair Orvithal had read the expulsion resolution 17 years earlier. I waited until the greeting was complete. I placed the document on the table. It was a single printed sheet. We print them in the Compact, because there is something about a physical document that digital transmission cannot replicate, a permanence that the moment deserves, and it was the Compact of Free Worlds membership application, completed, with the processing fee schedule attached. Sarathvel looked at it, she looked at me. I said the standard terms. That was all I said. She looked at the document for a long moment. I watched her read it, or at least read the heading and the first clause, which was enough. The standard terms were not punitive. They were the same terms that applied to any applicant for Compact membership, a commitment to the shared navigational database, participation in the arbitration mechanisms, a trade agreement framework. They were not designed to humiliate. They were designed to function, which is what every good agreement is designed to do. What they were not was an invitation to negotiate a collaborative framework. What they were was an application, a form, the kind of form you fill out when you want to join something that has decided what it is and does not need to explain itself to you. I watched Sarathvel process this. She said, the conclave envisioned a bilateral framework, mutual recognition of jurisdictions, coordination on transit corridor governance, a joint arbitration mechanism for disputes in overlapping. I said, the application is on the table. She stopped. The chamber was quiet. Through the high window, a vessel moved across the transit lane, a human commercial freighter, one of the regular runs, going about its business without reference to what was happening in the room below. Sarathvel sat with the silence for a moment. Then she said, "I will need to transmit this to the Conclave Council before I can respond." I said, "Of course." She transmitted it. I did not follow what happened in the internal conclave deliberations, because I was not present for them, and because what happened to the conclave in the years that followed is a different story from the one I am telling. What I know is that the delegation stayed for 3 days, and that the conversations during those 3 days were conducted on the terms of the application, as a membership inquiry, with our procedures, in our meeting space, at our table. And I know that when they left, Sarathvel looked at me in the entrance corridor and said, in a tone that was not quite diplomatic and not quite personal, something I have remembered since. She said, "The conclave did not expect this." I said, "I know." There was a pause. She said, "Was it always the plan?" I looked at her for a moment. She was young, and she was serious, and she was asking me a genuine question. The question of whether what had happened had been a strategy, whether the expulsion had been something we had engineered towards some pre-designed end, whether there was a mind somewhere that had looked at the conclave's architecture and calculated exactly how to use its own mechanisms against it. The honest answer is no. There was no plan. There was a filing that I made because it was the right record to make, and a walkout that we made because anything else would have been a lie, and 17 years of relationships that existed because relationships form between people who do useful things for each other. The compact was not the execution of a strategy. It was what happened when you remove the obstacle. But I also knew, and this is the thing I have spent the subsequent years understanding, that the absence of a plan does not mean the absence of a logic. The logic had been there. The conclave had looked at humanity and seen a supplicant, and the thing about supplicants is that they need you. The thing about humanity, in that chamber and in those years, was that we had been doing the work of not needing them for a very long time, quietly, in the outer corridors, in the trade agreements and the navigational data, and the 7 systems that found us useful. The Thasari had looked at the Vethara belt and seen leverage. They had not seen that the Vethara belt was just the part of the iceberg that was visible to a chamber that only looked at things within its own jurisdiction. What I said to Sarathvel was, it was a response. She considered this. Then she nodded with the particular quality of nod that says, "I understand what you are telling me, and I understand that it is the most I am going to get, and I will take it." She left. I stood in the entrance corridor for a while after the delegation was gone. The transit station hummed with its ordinary business. Somewhere in the outer corridors, the compact's fleet was running its regular patrols, not because anyone had ordered it to demonstrate anything, but because patrols are what fleets do. Somewhere in the Vethara belt, the mining consortium was on its 3rd expansion phase, unconstrained now by any secondary protocol, doing the work of extracting what was there. Somewhere in the Rothai communion, a data agreement was processing its 37th renewal, routine as a heartbeat. Mirova found me in the corridor. She stood beside me for a moment without speaking, which is her way. She said, "Well." I said, "They'll apply. Not yet, but they'll apply." She said, "How long?" I thought about it. I thought about Vetharsian, and about the 4 decades of archived proceedings, and about the quality of Sarathvel's attention in the meeting room, the attention of someone who had come to understand something that her predecessors had not understood until it was too late to matter. I said, "A few years." Mirova nodded. We walked back through the station together. The light through the corridor windows was the hard, clean light of the outer corridors, not the amber helioderm glow of the Hall of Compact, not the filtered station light of Meridian Crossing, but the direct, unmediated light of a place that had not been designed to impress anyone, only to work. I had been in that light for 11 years. I had stopped missing the other kind. People ask what the conclave smelled like. I tell them, on the night of the vote it smelled like flowers, the Thessari confidence certain of itself untroubled. What they do not ask, and what I find I want to tell them anyway, is what the transit station smelled like on the day of Sarathvel's visit. It smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the particular neutral cleanliness of a place whose only purpose is to get things done. It smelled like nothing in particular. It smelled like ours,